Welcome. Tonight, you will fall asleep to the legends of Rome. Stories of gods and warriors, of brothers who founded a city and fought to the death, of soldiers who held bridges against entire armies, of farmers who saved the republic and went back to their plows, of generals who crossed mountains with elephants, of senators who killed their friend to save their country. These are not the Greek myths. The Greeks had been telling stories for centuries when Rome was still a small village by the Tiber River. The Romans, when they grew powerful, borrowed many Greek stories and gave them Roman names. But they also had their own stories, their own founding myths, their own heroes, their own deeper mysteries. Tonight, 12 of those stories, told slowly, told calmly, told in the soft voice of a sleep narrator. Listen if you want. Drift off if sleep is near. The stories will continue without you. They have been told for 2,000 years. They will go on. You will hear of Aeneas, the Trojan prince who escaped the burning city and traveled across the Mediterranean to found a new home in Italy. You will hear of Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers raised by a wolf. You will hear of Numa Pompilius, who taught the early Romans how to worship their gods. You will hear of the last kings of Rome and the cruel act that gave birth to the Republic. You will hear of Horatius, who held a bridge against an army, of Mucius Scaevola, who burned his own hand to prove his courage, of Cincinnatus, who left his farm to save Rome, then returned to it, of Hannibal, who crossed the Alps with war elephants, of Spartacus, the gladiator who led the slaves, of Caesar, who became too powerful for his friends. 12 stories, 2 hours, one quiet night. Breathe slowly, settle in. The torches are lit. The stories begin. Long before there was a city called Rome, there was a war called Troy. The Greeks had besieged the great city for 10 years. We have heard, perhaps, of Hector and Achilles, of the wooden horse, of the city falling in flames. Among the Trojans who survived the fall was a prince named Aeneas. He was the son of Anchises, a noble of Troy, and Venus, the goddess of love. He was a warrior of the highest rank, second only to Hector in valor. When Troy fell, Aeneas knew that his time there was over. The gods had decided. A new home for him lay somewhere far across the sea. He gathered his elderly father, his young son Ascanius, and the household gods of Troy, small statues of the deities who had protected his family for generations. His wife Creusa was lost in the chaos of the burning city. He searched for her, calling her name through the smoke. He could not find her. He learned later, through a vision, that she had died and that the gods intended a different wife for him in the new land. Aeneas led a band of refugees from the burning ruins. They went to the coast. They built ships. They sailed. Their journey took years. They visited many lands. They tried to settle in some of them, but each time, signs from the gods made it clear that this was not the destined place. They were attacked by harpies, winged creatures with women's faces. They were nearly killed by the Cyclops Polyphemus, who had blinded Odysseus years before. They lost Aeneas's father on the way. He died of old age during the long voyage. They mourned him on the island of Sicily. After many years, the ships of Aeneas reached the coast of North Africa. They were taken in by Dido, the queen of the new city of Carthage. Dido was beautiful, wise, and lonely. She had fled her own homeland after her husband was murdered. She had built Carthage from nothing. She was a great queen. Aeneas and Dido fell in love. He stayed with her for months. The Trojan exiles settled into life in Carthage. They might have remained there forever. But the gods had another plan. Jupiter, the king of the gods, sent the messenger Mercury to Aeneas. Mercury told Aeneas that he had a destiny waiting for him in Italy. He could not stay with Dido. He must continue. Aeneas obeyed. He prepared his ships. He left Carthage in the night, without saying goodbye, because he knew that if he tried to explain, Dido would convince him to stay. When Dido woke and discovered that he had gone, she could not bear it. She ordered a great pyre built. She climbed onto it. She killed herself with Aeneas's own sword, which he had left behind. She cursed him with her dying breath. She prayed that her descendants would forever be the enemies of his descendants. The Carthaginians would later wage 3 terrible wars against the Romans, and the Romans would eventually destroy Carthage entirely. The curse, in this sense, came true. Aeneas sailed on. He came to the western coast of Italy. He landed at the mouth of a river that the locals called the Tiber. He was welcomed by King Latinus, the ruler of a small kingdom. Latinus had a daughter named Lavinia. An oracle had told Latinus that his daughter must marry a foreigner. He recognized Aeneas as the man the gods intended. But Lavinia had been promised to another man, a local prince named Turnus. Turnus was furious that Aeneas had been given his bride. He raised an army. He fought against Aeneas and the Trojans. The war was long. Many died. In the end, Aeneas killed Turnus in single combat. He married Lavinia. He founded a new city, which he named Lavinium after his wife. But the great city was not yet to come. It would be Aeneas's descendants, generations later, who would found Rome itself. This is the story of Aeneas. The Romans saw him as the ancestor of their entire people. They traced their lineage back through him to the Trojan royal house, and through his mother Venus to the gods themselves. The Roman poet Virgil wrote the great epic of Aeneas, the Aeneid, under the patronage of the Emperor Augustus, in the 1st century before the Common Era. The poem became one of the most influential works of literature in the Western tradition. It is still read today, 2,000 years later, by anyone who wants to understand how the Romans saw themselves. Sleep gently. The gods have plans for each of us, the Romans said. The plans are not always what we want, but they take us, eventually, to where we are meant to be. Several generations after Aeneas, his descendants ruled a small kingdom in central Italy called Alba Longa. The kings were proud and often quarrelsome. At one point, 2 brothers competed for the throne, Numitor and Amulius. Amulius won. He drove his brother into exile. He killed his brother's sons. And to make sure that his brother's line ended forever, he forced his brother's only daughter, Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal virgin, a priestess sworn to celibacy. As long as she had no children, no one could challenge his rule. But Rhea Silvia caught the eye of the god Mars, the Roman god of war. He came to her in secret. She bore twin sons, born from a union of a mortal princess and a god. When King Amulius discovered the babies, he was furious. He ordered them killed. The servants assigned to drown them in the Tiber River could not bring themselves to kill the infants directly. Instead, they placed the babies in a basket and set the basket adrift on the flooding river. The river would carry them away. Their deaths would be no one's responsibility. The basket drifted. It caught on the roots of a fig tree along the bank. The babies cried. A she-wolf coming down to the river to drink heard the crying. She came to the basket. She did not eat the babies. Instead, she carried them back to her cave. She nursed them at her own teats. She kept them warm. A woodpecker brought them food. The animals of the forest sheltered the children of Mars. After many weeks, a shepherd named Faustulus found the babies in the wolf's cave. He took them home to his wife, Acca Laurentia. They raised the boys as their own. They called them Romulus and Remus. The brothers grew up as shepherds. They were strong and quick. They became leaders among the young men of the area. They organized raids. They defended their flocks. They became famous in their small way, even before they knew who they really were. Eventually, By an accident, Remus was captured. He was brought before King Numa, his maternal grandfather, the rightful king who had been deposed by his brother. Numa recognized something in the young man's bearing. He questioned him. Remus told him about his brother, about being raised by the wolf, about the shepherd who had found them. Numa pieced the story together. These were his grandsons. Romulus and Remus learned their true identity. They gathered their friends from among the shepherds. They marched on Alba Longa. They killed the wicked king Aeneas. They restored their grandfather to the throne. But the brothers did not want to stay in Alba Longa. They wanted to found their own city. They returned to the place where the wolf had nursed them. They chose a hill. They began to plan. But which brother would be king? Who would name the city? They could not agree. They decided to let the gods choose. Each brother would stand on a hill and watch for omens, for birds flying overhead. Whichever brother saw more birds will be favored by the gods. Remus stood on the Aventine Hill. Romulus stood on the Palatine Hill. They waited. Remus saw 6 vultures. He rushed to tell his brother. Romulus then saw 12 vultures. They argued about which sign came first and which was more important. The argument grew heated. Romulus, in his impatience, began to mark the boundaries of his city. He plowed a furrow around the Palatine Hill. The walls would rise along this line. He warned that anyone who crossed the line uninvited would be killed. Remus, in his mockery, jumped over the furrow. Perhaps in jest, perhaps in anger. Romulus killed him. The story is told in different ways. Some versions say Romulus killed his brother in cold blood. Some say it was a sudden moment of rage. Some say it was a tragic accident. Whatever the exact circumstances, Romulus was now the sole founder. The city was his. He named it Roma, after himself. He was the first king. He ruled for many years. He gathered men from the surrounding regions, runaways, exiles, people with no place to go, and made them citizens of his new city. The city grew quickly. It needed women. The neighboring tribes refused to give their daughters in marriage. So Romulus arranged a great festival. He invited the neighboring Sabines as guests. When they came, his men seized their daughters. The Sabine women became Roman wives. This was the famous rape of the Sabine women, meaning, in a Latin sense, the seizure or carrying off. The Sabines went to war with Rome to reclaim their daughters. But the women themselves, by this point, had children with their Roman husbands. They threw themselves between the warring sides. They begged for peace. The two peoples merged into one. Rome was strengthened. Romulus ruled for 37 years. According to legend, at the end of his life, he was caught up in a great storm during a military review on the field of Mars. When the storm cleared, Romulus was gone. The Romans were told that the god Mars had taken him up into the heavens. He became a god himself, worshipped under the name Quirinus. This is the story of how Rome was founded. The Romans loved this story. They knew it was partly legend. They told it anyway. Their city had been founded by twins raised by a wolf. Their first king had killed his brother. Their citizens had been built from runaways and exiles. There was something honest about all this. Rome did not claim a noble beginning. It claimed a violent, opportunistic, scrappy beginning. And from that beginning, it grew to rule the known world. Sleep gently. The most powerful things, the Romans said, often have humble and difficult origins. Do not be ashamed of where you come from. Be careful of what you build from it. After Romulus disappeared, the Romans needed a new king. They debated. They argued. The Latins among them wanted a Latin king. The Sabines wanted a Sabine king. The two factions could not agree. Finally, they reached a compromise. They would choose a Sabine, but one who was widely respected for his wisdom and his piety. The man they chose was named Numa Pompilius. He lived in a small town outside Rome. He was already an older man, married, with a reputation for deep religious devotion. He was reluctant to take the throne. He preferred his quiet life, but the Romans were insistent. He agreed. He came to Rome. He became the second king. If Romulus had been a king of war, Numa was a king of peace. He spent the next 43 years of his reign building the institutions that would shape Roman religion for the next 1,000 years. He divided the year into 12 months. The Roman calendar before him had been confused. He organized it. He named the months. The names of our modern months, January, February, March, and so on, come from this ancient Roman ordering. January is named after Janus, the god of beginnings, who has two faces, one looking backward and one looking forward. February is named after the Februa, a purification ritual held in that month. March is named after Mars, the god of war. The calendar he set up would be revised many times, but its basic structure has lasted to today. He established the priesthoods. He created the order of the Vestal Virgins, 6 women dedicated to tending the sacred fire of Vesta, the hearth of Rome. This fire was never allowed to go out. As long as it burned, Rome would prosper. The Vestals served for 30 years. They were among the most honored women in Roman society. They had legal rights ordinary women did not have. They could give pardons to condemned prisoners they happened to encounter on the street. They were beyond ordinary law. He created the augurs, priests who interpreted the will of the gods through observation of birds and other natural signs. Before any major decision, declaring war, founding a colony, building a temple, the augurs would be consulted. He built the great temple of Janus in the Roman Forum. The temple had 2 doors. When Rome was at peace, the doors were closed. When Rome was at war, the doors were open. During Numa's entire 43-year reign, the doors of the temple of Janus remained closed. There was no war. He kept Rome at peace for over 4 decades. How? Some of it was diplomatic skill. Numa negociated. He made alliances. He resolved disputes before they escalated. But much of it was, in a legend, religious. He convinced the Romans that war was something the gods regulated. Wars could only be fought for just causes. Wars had to be declared by specific priests called the officiales. The officiales would travel to the enemy's border and formally declare the grievance. They would give the enemy 30 days to remedy the situation. Only if no remedy came would Rome go to war. This made war slow. It made war careful. It made war legitimate when it came. It also made war rare. The Romans, under Numa's system, did not go to war casually. They waited. They negotiated. They tried other means first. Numa also taught the Romans how to honor their dead. The household gods, the Laras and Penates, were small statues kept in every home, representing the spirits of ancestors and the guardians of the household. Romans made daily offerings to them. Food, wine, prayers. The dead were not gone, the Romans believed. They lived on in the rituals of their descendants. Numa is said to have been guided in all this by a nymph named Egeria. He would go alone to a sacred grove outside Rome. He would meet her there. She would teach him the laws and rituals he should establish. He was, in some versions, her lover, in others, her student. The Romans believed that the wisdom of Numa's reign came directly from the divine. When Numa died, after 43 years of peace, Egeria wept so deeply that she dissolved into a spring. The spring still flowed in the sacred grove, a reminder of her grief and her gift. This is the story of Numa Pompilius. The Romans remembered him as the king who had given them their religion. Without him, they said, Rome would have been just another small warrior tribe. With him, it became a city with priests, temples, calendars, laws of the divine. He turned the rough founders into a civilization. Sleep gently. Peace, the Romans understood, is also a kind of work. It does not come naturally. It must be built slowly with priests and laws and patience. Some kings build empires through war. Others build them through peace. Rome had 7 kings, according to legend. After Romulus and Numa came Tullus Hostilius, the warrior. After him came Ancus Marcius, the builder. After him came Tarquinius Priscus, the elder Tarquin. After him came Servius Tullius. And finally came Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. Tarquin the Proud was a tyrant. He had murdered his way to the throne. He ruled without consulting the Senate. He killed nobles who opposed him. He took whatever he wanted. He was hated. He was feared. His son, Sextus Tarquinius, was as bad as his father. The story of the fall of the kings begins with one specific act of cruelty. Sextus had visited the home of a Roman nobleman named Collatinus, whose wife was named Lucretia. Lucretia was famous for her virtue, her intelligence, her quiet beauty. Sextus had wanted her. He had been refused. Days later, he came back. He came alone. He came in the night. He came armed. He demanded that Lucretia submit to him. She refused. He threatened to kill her. She still refused. He threatened to kill her, then to kill a slave and arrange the bodies so that it would look as if she had been caught in adultery, destroying her reputation forever. Faced with this physical death, she could accept social disgrace that would harm her family forever. She could not. She submitted. The next morning, after he was gone, she sent for her husband and her father. She told them what had happened. She made them swear vengeance on the Tarquin family. Then, before they could stop her, she drew a knife she had hidden in her clothing and stabbed herself in the heart. She died on the spot. Her husband and father were destroyed. They were also enraged. They carried her body into the Roman Forum. They displayed it to the people. They told what had happened. A nobleman named Lucius Junius Brutus stepped forward. He had pretended to be a fool for years, playing dim-witted to avoid being killed by the Tarquins as a political threat. Now he revealed his true self. He gave a speech. He called for the overthrow of the Tarquin dynasty. The people rose up. They drove Tarquin the Proud and his sons out of Rome. They abolished the monarchy entirely. They swore that no king would ever again rule Rome. In place of a king, they would have 2 elected officials called consuls. The consuls would serve for 1 year, then step down. They could not be re-elected immediately. They would share power equally. If one consul became tyrannical, the other could override him. The system was designed specifically to prevent the rise of another Tarquin. This was the founding of the Roman Republic. The year, by the traditional reckoning, was 509 before the Common Era. The Republic would last for nearly 5 centuries, until the rise of the emperors. Brutus and Collatinus, Lucretia's husband, were elected as the first 2 consuls. Their first act was to make every Roman swear an oath. Never again would a king rule. Never again would the family of Tarquin be allowed back in the city. The Tarquins did not give up easily. They went to neighboring cities. They tried to raise armies to retake Rome. They sent agents to plot. They came close to succeeding several times. The hardest moment came when Brutus's own sons were caught plotting to restore the Tarquins. They had been raised in the old aristocratic circles. They missed the privileges of the monarchy. They wanted it back. Brutus, as one of the consuls, had to judge them. He had to choose between his sons and the republic he had just founded. He chose the republic. He ordered his own sons executed. He watched the execution himself. The lictors, the bearers of the rods of office, beat them with the rods, then beheaded them. Brutus sat on his curule chair, his face stone, refusing to look away. This act, the willingness to kill his own sons for the principle of the republic, defined Roman civic virtue for centuries. The story was told to every Roman child. It said, "The state matters more than family. The republic matters more than your own blood. If you would not kill your own children to defend it, you do not understand what it means to be a free Roman." Brutus himself died not long after in battle against the Tarquin's allies. He was succeeded by other consuls. The republic survived. The Tarquins were never restored. Centuries later, when a different man named Brutus, Marcus Brutus, descendant of this Lucius Junius Brutus, would be asked to participate in the assassination of Julius Caesar, he would remember his ancestor. He would think of the founding act. He would conclude that he, too, had to choose the republic over his friend. Sleep gently. The freedom we enjoy was, in many cases, paid for by people we have never heard of. They made hard choices long ago. They sometimes killed people they loved. We inherit what they built. We are often unaware of the cost. Soon after the founding of the Republic, the Etruscans, a powerful neighboring people, supported the deposed Tarquins. The Etruscan king Lars Porsena gathered a great army. He marched on Rome. The Romans, still organizing their new government, were unprepared. The army was too large to face in open battle. The countryside was abandoned. People fled into the city. The walls were Rome's only defense. There was, however, one weakness: the Sublician Bridge, the only wooden bridge across the Tiber. If the Etruscan army crossed it, they would be inside the city walls. Rome would fall. The Romans began to chop down the bridge, but chopping it down took time. The Etruscan army was nearly upon them. A soldier named Horatius Cockles stepped forward. His name meant Horatius the One-Eyed. He had lost an eye in earlier battles, but his nickname only made him more famous. He proposed a plan. He would stand at the far end of the bridge, the side closest to the enemy, and hold off the Etruscan army for as long as it took to chop down the bridge behind him. Two other soldiers volunteered to stand with him: Spurius Larsius and Titus Herminius. The three of them walked across the bridge, drew their swords, and waited. The Etruscan army came. The front ranks of the enemy were astonished to see only 3 men blocking their way. They attacked. The 3 Romans fought. Together they could hold the narrow bridge against the first ranks of the enemy. The enemy could only come at them in small numbers, because the bridge was narrow. The terrain favored the defenders. Meanwhile, behind them, Romans worked frantically with axes. They chopped at the supports of the bridge. The wood began to splinter. The Etruscans, frustrated, sent forward their best warriors. Larsius was wounded. He had to retreat. Then Herminius was wounded. He had to retreat. Horatius was alone. He fought on. He was a single man against an army. The bridge behind him was being chopped down. The work was almost finished. The Romans called out to Horatius to retreat, to come back, to save himself, to cross before the bridge collapsed. Horatius refused. He kept fighting. He held his ground. He took wound after wound. He sang battle cries. He taunted the Etruscans. He invited each individual warrior to come and try him. Behind him, the supports of the bridge gave way. The bridge collapsed with a great crash into the river. Horatius was on the wrong side. He was stranded with an entire army on the same side as him. He prayed to the river god Tiber. He asked the river to carry him home safely. He jumped into the water in full armor. The Etruscans on the bank watched, expecting him to drown. He did not drown. The river god, the Romans believed, lifted him gently. He swam to the Roman bank. He climbed out, wounded, exhausted, but alive. The Romans cheered. They had saved their city. Lars Porsena, the Etruscan king, was so impressed by Horatius's courage that he eventually made peace with Rome. He sent Horatius gifts. He praised him as one of the great warriors of any age. The Romans built a statue of Horatius in the Forum. They gave him as much land as he could plow in a single day. He lived the rest of his life as a Roman hero, but quietly, working his fields, walking with a limp from his many wounds. This story was told to Roman children for centuries. It said, one person with enough courage can stand against an army. One person can save a city. The defense of freedom sometimes comes down to a single act of impossible bravery. In the 19th century, the English historian Thomas Macaulay wrote a long poem about Horatius. The poem became famous. School children across the British Empire memorized lines from it. The image of Horatius on the bridge became, for 19th century England, a symbol of standing firm against impossible odds. Sleep gently. There are moments in life when one person holding their ground can change everything. Most of us will never face such a moment, but the possibility is there. The example exists. After Horatius held the bridge, Lars Porsena did not give up entirely. He laid siege to Rome. The siege went on for weeks. The Romans inside the walls began to run short of food. A young Roman noble named Gaius Mucius decided to act. He would assassinate Lars Porsena. Without the king, the Etruscan army would lose its leader. The siege would collapse. He went to the Senate. He asked for permission to leave the city, to sneak into the enemy camp, and to attempt the killing. The Senate, after debate, gave him permission. He dressed in plain clothes. He hid a dagger in his cloak. He slipped out of the city in the dark and made his way to the Etruscan camp. He came to the king's tent. There were guards. He waited. He saw a richly dressed man giving orders to soldiers. He assumed this was the king. He approached. He drew his dagger. He stabbed, but he had killed the wrong man. The richly dressed person was Porsena's secretary, not the king himself. Porsena was elsewhere in the camp. Gaius Mucius had killed the wrong target. He was seized immediately. He was dragged before the real king. Porsena demanded to know who he was and what he was doing. Gaius Mucius answered defiantly. He was a Roman. He had come to kill the king. He had failed today, but there were 300 other young Romans, he claimed, who had all sworn the same oath as he had. One by one, they would come for the king. The king would not survive. Porsena was alarmed. He threatened Gaius with torture. He said he would burn him alive if Mucius did not reveal more about this conspiracy. Gaius Mucius walked to a brazier of burning coals that stood nearby. He thrust his right hand into the fire. He held it there. The flames burned his flesh. He did not flinch. He did not cry out. He looked the king in the eye while his hand burned away. He spoke calmly. He told the king that the Romans did not fear pain. The Romans would do whatever was necessary to defend their freedom. He held his hand in the fire until it was charred beyond use. Porsena was astonished. He had never seen such a thing. He had Mucius removed from the fire. He had his wounds treated. He told Mucius that he was free to return to Rome. Mucius walked back to the city, his right hand permanently destroyed. From that day on, he was called Mucius Scaevola, Mucius the left-handed, because he had no right hand to fight with. The Romans honored him. They held him up as an example of Roman courage. Lars Porsena, shaken by what he had seen, soon made peace with Rome. The siege ended. The Etruscans went home. The Romans believed that Mucius's act of self-mutilation had saved the city. By showing the king what a single Roman would endure rather than betray his country, he had convinced Porsena that conquering Rome would be impossibly costly. Better to make peace. Whether the story is entirely true is debated, but the Romans believed it. They told it. They taught it to their children. They wanted every young Roman to know that this was what Roman bravery looked like. Not just dying for the country, but suffering for it. Calmly, without complaint, with dignity. Sleep gently. There's a kind of courage that comes from being willing to lose what is most precious to you in order to demonstrate what you stand for. Mucius gave his hand. The hand was the cost. The message was beyond price. A generation after Mucius, Rome faced another crisis. A neighboring tribe, called the Equi, had trapped a Roman army in a mountain valley. The army could not retreat. They were surrounded. They would starve. Rome was about to lose its army. The Senate met in emergency session. They needed a leader who could move quickly. They needed someone who could make decisions without the usual delays of consul debate. Roman law allowed for an emergency office called the dictator. The dictator had absolute power. He could be appointed for up to 6 months. After his term, he had to step down. The Senate considered who to appoint. They thought of a former consul named Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus. He had been a respected leader years before, but he had lost much of his land and money. He now lived on a small farm across the Tiber, doing his own plowing. A delegation of senators went to find him. They dressed in their formal togas. They crossed the river. They walked to his farm. They saw an old man in his work clothes, sweating in the field, guiding a plow behind his ox. They called out to him. He stopped. He saw the togas. He asked his wife to bring his own toga from the house. He put on over his work clothes. He walked to meet them. The senators told him, Rome needs a dictator. The Senate has chosen him. Cincinnatus did not refuse. He did not bargain. He did not ask for terms. He left his plow standing in a half-finished furrow. He went with the senators to Rome. The next morning, he gathered every able-bodied Roman male and led them out to rescue the trapped army. He used his command authority decisively. He divided his forces. He set ambushes. He attacked the Equi from 2 sides at once. The battle was brief. The Equi were defeated. The trapped Roman army was freed. The Equi general surrendered. Cincinnatus took the surrender. He demanded that the Equi pay a small indemnity, surrender their weapons, and pass under a yoke, a humiliating ritual where defeated soldiers walked under a low crossbar held by their enemies. The Equi did so. Cincinnatus returned to Rome with a victorious army. The city was relieved. The crisis was over. He had been appointed dictator for 6 months. He had absolute power. The constitutional limits were only on paper. In practice, who would stop him if he chose to stay? He stepped down. After 15 days, he had finished the task. He laid down the dictatorship. He returned to his farm. He picked up his plow where he had left it. He went back to his half-finished furrow. This is the story of Cincinnatus, the man who held absolute power for 2 weeks and then willingly gave it up. The man who could have stayed a dictator and chose to be a farmer. The Romans saw this as the ideal of citizenship, to serve when called, to give your all, to take the power necessary to do the job, then to return to your ordinary life when a job was done. Centuries later, when George Washington, the first president of the United States, refused to seek a 3rd term, he was conscious of Cincinnatus. He believed he was doing what the Roman had done, setting an example of stepping down voluntarily so that no one would become too powerful. The American Officers' Society, called the Society of the Cincinnati, was named after him. The city of Cincinnati, Ohio, is named after that society. A small Roman farmer, 2,500 years ago, gave his name to a major American city and to one of the founding ideals of American democracy. Sleep gently. The willingness to give up power when the time is right, when the job is done, is one of the rarest forms of human virtue. Cincinnatus had it. Few in history have shared it. It is worth remembering when we see leaders who refuse to let go. For centuries after the founding of the Republic, Rome expanded slowly. It conquered the other Italian tribes. It dominated the peninsula. Then it began to compete with the city of Carthage, the great trading power on the North African coast. Carthage had been founded by Dido, the woman who had cursed Aeneas. The curse, perhaps, was finally finding its fulfillment. Rome and Carthage fought 3 terrible wars called the Punic Wars. In the first war, The Romans built their first real navy and defeated the Carthaginians at sea. They took the island of Sicily. In the Second War, a Carthaginian general did something extraordinary. He decided to invade Rome from the north by crossing the Alps. The general was Hannibal Barca. He was 30 years old when he set out. He would change the course of Mediterranean history. Hannibal gathered an army of 40,000 soldiers and 37 war elephants. The elephants were trained for battle. They were terrifying weapons. He marched from Carthaginian Spain through southern Gaul and reached the foot of the Alps. The Alps had never been crossed by an army with elephants. The mountains were considered impassable for such forces. The native tribes attacked them as they climbed. The cold was severe. Avalanches killed soldiers. Many elephants died. By the time Hannibal reached northern Italy, he had lost nearly half his army and most of his elephants. But he was through. He was inside the Roman heartland. Rome was suddenly facing an army it had not expected to face for years. The Roman army marched out to meet him. They fought at the Trebia River. Hannibal won. The Romans marched again. They fought at Lake Trasimene. Hannibal won in a brilliant ambush in dense fog. The Romans gathered an even larger army, 80,000 men. They marched out to crush Hannibal at a place called Cannae. Hannibal had only 50,000. He should have lost by sheer numbers. He won. He won so completely that Cannae became, for 2,000 years, the textbook example of a perfectly executed battle. Hannibal arranged his weaker center to gradually retreat, drawing the Roman army deeper into his formation. His stronger flanks then closed around the Romans, surrounding them entirely. The Romans, packed too close together to use their weapons effectively, were slaughtered. 50,000 Roman soldiers died in a single day. The Roman state lost a quarter of its adult male population. Rome should have fallen. Any other nation would have surrendered. Hannibal expected the Romans to send envoys to negotiate terms. They did not. The Romans instead did something stunning. They refused to acknowledge that they had been defeated. They held no funerals for the dead. That would have demoralized the city. They voted to continue the war. They raised a new army. They reorganized their command structure. They made it illegal to even speak of peace. For the next 14 years, Hannibal remained in Italy. He could not take Rome itself. The city was too well fortified. The Romans avoided pitched battles with him. They attacked his supply lines. They harassed his foragers. They wore him down. Meanwhile, a young Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio went to Spain. He attacked the Carthaginian forces there. He took the Carthaginian cities. He cut off Hannibal's reinforcements. Scipio then crossed to Africa. He invaded Carthaginian territory directly. The government of Carthage, panicking, recalled Hannibal from Italy to defend the homeland. Hannibal left Italy after 15 years of campaigning. He returned to Africa to defend Carthage. He met Scipio at the Battle of Zama. For the first time in his career, Hannibal lost. Carthage surrendered. The Second Punic War was over. Rome had won. Hannibal did not die at Zama. He survived. He returned to Carthage. He worked for some years as a politician trying to reform the city. The Romans eventually pressured Carthage to exile him. He fled to the east. He served various Hellenistic kings as a military advisor. The Romans kept demanding his extradition. Eventually, cornered with no escape, Hannibal poisoned himself rather than be handed over. A third war between Rome and Carthage would follow decades later. In that war, the Romans, no longer willing to tolerate any Carthaginian threat, destroyed the city entirely. They burned it. They salted the fields where it had stood so that nothing would grow. Dido's curse, in this final way, had been answered. The descendants of Aeneas had destroyed her city utterly. But Hannibal's name lived on. He is, even today, considered one of the greatest military commanders in history. His tactics at Cannae are still studied at military academies. His crossing of the Alps remains one of the most audacious feats in the history of warfare. He nearly destroyed Rome with an army half the size of his enemies. Sleep gently. Hannibal lost the war, but won enduring fame. Sometimes the greatest stories belong to those who came closest, in the end, to changing the world, even though they did not succeed. Roman society was built on slavery. As the Republic expanded, the wars brought back thousands of captives. They became slaves. They worked the fields. They served in the houses. They fought in the arenas for the entertainment of the citizens. The arena fighters were called gladiators. They were the most physically capable of the slaves. They were trained in gladiator schools, almost like military academies, to fight each other for sport. Most of them died in the arena sooner or later. The lucky ones survived long enough to become favorites of the crowd, who would sometimes spare them. In the year 73 before the Common Era, in a gladiator school in the town of Capua, a Thracian slave named Spartacus organized a revolt. He gathered 70 other gladiators. They armed themselves with kitchen knives. They broke out of the school. They fled into the countryside. They were soon joined by escaped slaves from neighboring estates. Their numbers grew. Within months, the band had become a small army. The Romans, when they noticed, sent a small force to put down what they thought was a minor disturbance. The small force was destroyed by Spartacus. The Romans sent a larger force. It too was destroyed. The slave army grew. Word spread. Slaves across Italy heard that a former gladiator had defeated Roman forces and was offering freedom to anyone who joined him. They escaped from estates and made their way to him. Within 2 years, Spartacus commanded an army of 70,000. They moved through Italy, defeating Roman force after Roman force. They had access to weapons captured from defeated Roman armies. They had Spartacus, who turned out to be a brilliant tactical commander. They had something almost unprecedented for slaves in the ancient world: momentum and hope. Spartacus's goal seems to have been to lead his people out of Italy entirely, to cross the Alps, to disperse to the various lands his soldiers had come from. He marched them north, but the slave army was divided. Some of them did not want to leave. They wanted to keep fighting in Italy. They wanted to take the wealth of Roman estates. They were, in some cases, more interested in plunder than in escape. A faction split off. Spartacus and his main force went south, then turned around. Politics within the slave army were difficult. The Romans, by now, took the revolt seriously. They appointed a wealthy man named Marcus Licinius Crassus to handle it. Crassus was the richest man in Rome, perhaps in the world. He had political ambition. He wanted military glory to match his wealth. Crassus raised a massive army. He pursued Spartacus. He cornered the slave forces in the south of Italy. The final battle was at the river Salaris. Spartacus's army fought hard. They knew that defeat meant death. There was nothing to retreat to. They charged the Roman lines. Spartacus himself was killed in the fighting. His body, according to Roman accounts, was never identified. He died in the press of bodies. His army was annihilated. The Romans took 6,000 survivors prisoner. They crucified all of them. They lined a road from Capua to Rome, about 120 miles, with crosses. One slave dying every 20 paces for 120 miles. The display was intended as a warning to any future slave who might consider rebellion. The warning worked in the short term. There were no major slave revolts in Italy for the next century and a half. But Spartacus's name survived. Over the centuries, he has become a symbol of the fight against oppression, of the dignity of even the lowest in society standing up against their masters, of the moment when a few escaped gladiators became a movement that nearly toppled the Roman state. In modern times, Spartacus has been the subject of plays, of novels, of films. The image of him, gladiator, slave, leader of an army of the dispossessed, has inspired political movements far beyond his original context. A group of German socialists in the early 20th century named themselves the Spartacists in his honor. He never tried to abolish slavery in principle. He did not lead a movement of ideology. He led simply a movement of people who wanted to be free. They lost, but they had, for 2 years, defeated Rome. Sleep gently. The defeated in history sometimes win in memory what they lost in war. The Romans buried Spartacus. They could not bury his name. The Roman Republic, which Lucius Brutus had helped found by overthrowing the Tarquin kings, lasted for nearly 500 years. Then it died, slowly at first, then suddenly. The cause was, in part, the increasing scale of Roman power. The Republic had been designed for a city-state. When Rome ruled the whole Mediterranean, the structures could no longer cope. The generals who conquered distant lands became too rich and too independent for the Senate to control. The cause was also the rise of one specific man. Gaius Julius Caesar was born to a noble but not wealthy family in the year 100 before the Common Era. He was ambitious from his earliest years. He climbed the political ladder. He served as quaestor, as aedile, as praetor. He went into massive debt to fund his political campaigns. He was famous for his eloquence, his charm, his energy. He was also famous for his political ruthlessness. He needed money. He needed military glory to match the wealth of the great noble families. He arranged to be sent to govern the provinces in Gaul, modern France, and Belgium. He took an army. He spent the next 9 years conquering the various Gallic tribes. The Gauls fought hard, but they were no match for organized Roman legions led by Caesar. He destroyed entire tribes. He enslaved hundreds of thousands. He became, in those 9 years, the richest and most popular general in Rome. His political rivals in Rome were terrified of him. They tried to recall him. They tried to force him to disband his army before returning. They threatened him with prosecution for war crimes. There were many he could have been prosecuted for. Caesar refused to disband. He marched his army back toward Rome. When he reached the Rubicon, the small river that marked the legal boundary between Gaul and Italy, he hesitated. To cross it with his army was a declaration of civil war. To cross it was to commit treason. He crossed. He uttered, according to legend, the famous phrase, "The die is cast." The civil war that followed lasted for years. Caesar defeated the Senate's army at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece. He defeated the rebellious provinces in Africa. He defeated the last of the resistance in Spain. By the end, he was the only military power left in Rome. He was made dictator for life. He held all the offices. He was, in effect, the king the Romans had sworn 5 centuries earlier would never rule them again. He used his power well in many ways. He reformed the calendar. He extended Roman citizenship to provinces. He proposed land reform for the poor. He built libraries. He pardoned many of his political enemies. But he had become too powerful. The senators of the old aristocracy could not accept a king. They began to plot. The conspiracy was led by Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus was a descendant of the Lucius Junius Brutus, who had founded the Republic by killing his own sons. He felt the weight of his family's legacy. He had been close to Caesar. Caesar had pardoned him, had treated him as a son in some ways. But Brutus believed that Caesar was destroying the Republic. He believed that killing Caesar was his duty as a Roman, even though it meant killing a friend. The conspirators chose a meeting of the Senate to attack. The date was the Ides of March, the 15th, in the year 44 before the Common Era. Caesar had been warned by a soothsayer to beware the Ides. He had ignored the warning. He entered the Senate. The conspirators surrounded him under the guise of presenting a petition. They drew daggers from their robes. They struck. Caesar fought back at first. He stabbed at his attackers with a stylus, a writing instrument. He tried to escape, but there were 23 of them. They were everywhere. He was wounded again and again. He saw Brutus among them. He gave up. According to one tradition, his final words were, "Et Brute, and you Brutus?" Meaning that he could not understand how his friend could join the killers. According to another tradition, in Greek, he said, "Even you, my child?" He fell. He bled out on the Senate floor. The conspirators expected to be hailed as heroes. They expected the Roman people to celebrate the restoration of the Republic. It did not happen. The Roman people did not see Caesar as a tyrant. They had loved him. They saw Brutus and the others as murderers of a popular leader. Mark Antony, Caesar's friend and lieutenant, gave a famous speech at Caesar's funeral that turned the crowd into a mob. The conspirators had to flee the city. A civil war followed. Caesar's adopted son Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, and Mark Antony hunted down the conspirators one by one. Brutus and Cassius were defeated at the Battle of Philippi. Both committed suicide rather than be captured. Octavian and Antony then turned on each other. Another civil war followed. Antony lost. He killed himself in Alexandria after the defeat of his Egyptian allies. Cleopatra, his lover and Egypt's queen, killed herself with a snake bite. Octavian was left alone. He became the first Roman emperor. He took the name Augustus, meaning venerable or majestic. The Republic was over. The age of emperors had begun. The Republic had lasted 5 centuries. It died in the assassination of one man and in the civil wars that followed. The assassins had tried to save the Republic. They had killed it instead. This is the story of Julius Caesar and the Ides of March. The Romans remembered it as a great tragedy. Shakespeare wrote a play about it 15 centuries later, which is still performed. The lesson the Romans drew was not simple. It was in part that great men can become too powerful. It was in part that the friends who kill the tyrant often end up worse than the tyrant. It was in part that beware the Ides of March, beware the moment when the powers around you align against you, even your closest friends. Sleep gently. Friends sometimes turn into killers. Kings sometimes deserve to die, and sometimes do not. The line between them is never as clear as we wish it were. There are more stories. There's also more to know about the Romans themselves, about their gods, about their daily lives, about the way they thought and worked and worshipped. Before we close, let us walk through some of these quieter corners of Roman civilization. We begin with the gods. The Romans had 1,000 gods. Most of them were small, gods of specific places, specific events, specific household functions. But the major gods, the ones worshipped by the whole state, were a recognizable family. We will name some of them. Jupiter was the king of the gods. He was the Roman version of Zeus, but with a different personality. The Greek Zeus was lustful and unpredictable. The Roman Jupiter was more dignified, the father of the city, the guardian of oaths, the giver of laws. His great temple stood on the Capitoline Hill, the highest of the 7 hills of Rome. Every Roman triumph, the great procession given to a victorious general, ended at his temple. The general would climb the steps and dedicate his victory to Jupiter. The god was, in a way, the divine emperor of Rome long before any human emperor sat on a throne. Mars was the god of war. He was the Roman version of Ares, but, like Jupiter, with a different character. The Greek Ares was disliked even by the other gods. He was bloody and reckless, the spirit of mindless violence. The Roman Mars was respected. He was the founder's father, the god who protected Roman armies in just wars, the spirit of disciplined courage. The Romans saw themselves as a martial people, in a way the Greeks did not. Mars was central to their identity. The month of March is named after him. The Campus Martius, the field of Mars, was the great gathering place for the Roman army. Venus was the goddess of love and beauty. She was the Roman version of Aphrodite. She had a special connection to the Roman state. She was through Aeneas, the divine ancestor of the Roman people. Julius Caesar claimed descent from her. Many noble Roman families traced their lineage through her. She was both a sensual goddess and a maternal one, the mother of the city itself. Janus was a uniquely Roman god. He had no Greek equivalent. He was the god of beginnings, of doorways, of transitions. He was depicted with two faces, one looking forward into the future, one looking backward into the past. His temple in the Roman Forum had two doors that were closed in times of peace and opened in times of war. He was the god of January, the month named after him, the month that begins the year. He was the patron of every threshold, every doorway, every moment when one phase of life ends and another begins. Vesta was the goddess of the hearth. Every Roman home had a small hearth dedicated to her. The cooking fire was also a sacred space. Her great temple in the Forum housed the eternal flame of Rome itself. 6 women, the Vestal Virgins, tended this flame day and night. If it went out, the Romans believed Rome would fall. The Vestal Virgins were among the most honored women in Roman society. They had legal rights ordinary women lacked. They could own property. They could free slaves. They could pardon condemned criminals they met by chance on the street. They served for 30 years. If they violated their vows of chastity, they were buried alive, a punishment of incomprehensible cruelty by modern standards, but one the Romans believed necessary to maintain the purity of the sacred fire. Saturn was an ancient god, older than Jupiter in Roman mythology. He was the god of agriculture and time. The Romans associated him with a lost golden age, before history, when humans lived in harmony and there was no hunger and no war. His festival, Saturnalia, was celebrated in late December. During Saturnalia, the social order was reversed for several days. Masters served their slaves at table. Children gave orders to their parents. People gave each other gifts. The festival was a kind of letting go before the new year, a reminder that the social order was made by humans and could, briefly, be unmade. The Christian celebration of Christmas, established 4 centuries later, took over much of the customs and timing of Saturnalia. The gift-giving, the feasting, the special meal, these are old Roman traditions baptized in the new religion. Mercury was the messenger of the gods, the Roman version of Hermes. He was the patron of travelers, merchants, and thieves. He guided souls to the underworld. He wore winged sandals and carried the caduceus, the staff with 2 serpents twined around it. The caduceus is still used today as a symbol of medicine, though, technically, it was the staff of Mercury, not of the god of healing. Mercury was clever, mischievous, and useful. Bacchus was the god of wine and ecstatic celebration, the Roman version of Dionysus. His festivals were wild, the Bacchanalia. Drinking, dancing, sometimes violence. The Roman Senate eventually banned the Bacchanalia in their wilder forms. In the year 186 before the Common Era, they passed laws restricting the cult, considering it a threat to social order. But Bacchus continued to be worshipped in tamer forms throughout Roman history. Minerva was the goddess of wisdom, of skill, of war fought with strategy rather than brute force. She was the Roman version of Athena. She was particularly honored by craftsmen, by writers, by scholars. Her sacred animal was the owl. Her temple stood on the Capitoline Hill alongside Jupiter's. There were many more. Diana, the goddess of the hunt and the moon. Apollo, the god of music and prophecy. Neptune, the god of the sea. Pluto, the god of the underworld. Vulcan, the god of fire and metalwork. Ceres, the goddess of agriculture. Each of them had temples, priests, and festivals. Beneath these major gods, every Roman household worshipped its own particular spirits. The Laras were the guardian spirits of the household, the ancestors who continued to protect the family. The Penates were the gods of the pantry, of food storage. The Genius was the spirit of the father of the family, the protective power of the household head. Each Roman home had a small shrine, called a lararium, where daily offerings were made to these household spirits. Breadcrumbs, wine drops, small prayers. The Romans were intensely religious. They believed that the gods were everywhere, in the rivers, in the fields, in the air, in a household. They believed that the survival of Rome depended on maintaining the right relationship with these divine forces. Religion was not a private matter. It was a civic duty. Public officials performed public sacrifices. The state itself was, in some ways, a religious institution. This is the world the Romans lived in, a world full of gods, a world where the divine was never far, a world where every meal began with a small offering to the household gods, and every battle began with a sacrifice to Mars. Now we turn to two more stories, Roman stories not yet told. The first is the story of Coriolanus. In the early years of the Republic, a Roman noble named Gnaeus Marcius distinguished himself in battle. He led the assault that captured the enemy city of Corioli. From this victory, he gained the name Coriolanus, meaning of Corioli. He became a famous general. He was admired for his courage. He was hated for his arrogance. He had no patience for the common people. He believed that only the aristocratic class, the patricians, should have political power. He spoke against the plebeians, the common Roman citizens, every chance he got. He proposed laws that would have stripped them of political rights. The plebeians, by this time, had organized themselves. They had won the right to elect representatives called tribunes. The tribunes had the power to veto Senate decisions. The plebeians used this power to defend themselves against laws that would hurt them. When Coriolanus pushed his anti-plebeian measures too far, the tribunes summoned him to trial. He could have stayed and defended himself. He chose, instead, to leave Rome entirely. He went to the Volsci, the very people he had been fighting against. He offered his services. The Volsci, knowing what a brilliant general he was, accepted him. Coriolanus led the Volsci army against Rome. He was very good. The Volsci, who had never been a match for Rome before, now defeated Roman forces in battle after battle. The cities around Rome fell to them. Coriolanus reached the very gates of his former home city. The Roman Senate sent ambassadors to him, asking him to relent. He refused. In desperation, the Romans sent his mother and his wife. They came out to the Volsci camp. They begged him to spare the city. His mother fell to her knees before him. She told him that he was about to commit a great wrong, that he was about to destroy the city that had raised him, that she could not live with such shame. Coriolanus could not refuse his mother. He turned his army around. He led the Volsci away. The Volsci, when they realized what had happened, killed him. He had not destroyed Rome. He had betrayed them by sparing it. They turned on him. He died in their camp, far from his city, hated by both sides. This is the story of Coriolanus. Shakespeare wrote a play about it 2,000 years later. The story is a tragedy. Coriolanus had been wronged by Rome in his own view. He had taken revenge by joining the enemy. But when a moment came to destroy what he claimed to hate, he could not. His love for his mother, and through her for the city, overcame his rage. He gave up his vengeance. He paid for that with his life. The Romans told the story as a warning about pride, about what happens to a man who hates the common people, about what happens when a leader cannot live within the limits of his own city. The pride of Coriolanus had nearly destroyed Rome. His love for his mother had saved it. Sleep gently. The most dangerous people in any society are sometimes those most talented, most accomplished, but unable to share power. They become destructive when they cannot rule. Coriolanus could not become a citizen. He had to become a king or a destroyer. He failed at both. The second is the story of the sack of Rome by the Gauls. In the year 390 before the Common Era, the city of Rome was sacked by a roaming army of Gauls, Celtic tribesmen from the north. The disaster was so complete that the Romans struggled to recover from it. The memory of it shaped the city for centuries. The Gauls were led by a chieftain named Remus. They had moved south looking for new lands. They besieged the Etruscan city of Clusium. The Clusians appealed to Rome for help. The Romans sent ambassadors to mediate. The Roman ambassadors, against the rules of diplomatic immunity, joined in the fighting on the side of Clusium. The Gauls were outraged. They abandoned the siege of Clusium and marched directly on Rome. A Roman army met them at the river Allia. The Roman army was destroyed. The road to Rome was open. The Roman Senate was paralyzed. Most of the city's population fled. Only a small garrison and a few of the older senators remained. The senators, the legend goes, dressed in their formal togas. They sat in their curule chairs. They waited for the enemy with dignity, refusing to flee. The Gauls entered Rome. They found the city mostly empty. They came to the forum. They saw the senators sitting motionless in their formal robes. The Gauls were astonished. One Gaul stretched out his hand to stroke the long white beard of a senator named Marcus Pompilius. The senator, insulted by the touch, struck the Gaul with his ivory staff. The Gaul killed him on the spot. The other senators were also killed. The Gauls then began to burn the city. They destroyed houses. They looted temples. They killed citizens. The last Roman defenders retreated to the Capitoline Hill, the highest hill in the city, easily defended. The Gauls besieged the hill. They tried to take it by storm. They failed. They settled in for a long siege. One night, the Gauls tried to climb the hill in secret. They moved silently up the steep slopes. They were almost at the top. The Roman sentries had not noticed them. But there were geese on the Capitoline Hill, sacred geese dedicated to the goddess Juno. The geese, hearing the Gauls climb, began to honk. Loudly, frantically, the honking woke the Roman guard. The commander, Marcus Manlius, was the first to respond. He pushed the climbing Gauls back. He held the ridge until reinforcements came. The Gauls were repulsed. Manlius was honored as a savior of the city. He was given the title Capitolinus, the Capitoline. The geese were honored too. For centuries afterward, the Romans kept sacred geese on the Capitoline Hill. Each year, on the anniversary of the Gauls' attack, the geese were honored in a ceremony. Dogs, by contrast, were treated harshly that day because the dogs of the Capitoline had been silent during the attack, while the geese had given the alarm. The siege continued for months. Eventually, the Romans were starving. They opened negotiations. They agreed to pay a large ransom in gold to make the Gauls leave. The Gauls brought scales. They began to weigh the gold. The Romans accused them of using rigged scales. Brennus, the Gallic chieftain, was insulted. He drew his sword. He threw the sword onto the scale, adding its weight to the gold the Romans owed. He cried out the words that became famous: Vi victis, woe to the conquered. The Romans paid the additional gold. The Gauls left, but the Romans never forgot. The phrase "vi victis," woe to the conquered, became, in time, almost a Roman motto. They turned it on its head. They made it a warning to themselves. Never be conquered. Never be in a position where the victors set the terms. Become the conquerors yourselves. Always. The next 2 centuries of Roman history were, in many ways, the story of Rome rebuilding from this catastrophe and then expanding to make sure such a thing never happened again. The Roman drive for empire, in this reading, was driven in part by the trauma of the sack of 390 BCE. The Romans had been weak once. They would never be weak again. Sleep gently. The history of nations is sometimes shaped by their wounds. The Romans never forgot the day the Gauls walked into their forum. They built the rest of their empire, in part, on the memory of that humiliation. These are the additional stories. There are still hundreds more. The Roman writers gave us histories that fill many volumes. We have stopped, tonight, at 15 tales. The Romans believed that stories were how civilizations remembered themselves. They told their children these stories. They carved them into temple walls. They wrote them into school texts. They wanted every Roman to know what it meant to be Roman. We are not Romans, but we have inherited so much of their world. Our laws, our calendar, our buildings, our languages, our ideas about citizenship and duty and law. The civilization we live in today is, in many ways, the civilization the Romans built, modified and continued by the centuries that came after them. When you walk through any old European city, you walk past stones that the Romans laid. When you read the news, you encounter a world organized by structures the Romans first imagined. When you swear an oath, when you sign a contract, when you vote, you're doing things the Romans did. You are part of a continuous tradition that goes back through the medieval church, through the early Christian world, through the High Empire, through the Republic, back to the founding by Aeneas and the twins raised by the wolf. That is not a small inheritance. Sleep gently. The torches that lit the Roman Forum 2,000 years ago have, in their way, lit the path that brought us to this night. You are here, hearing these stories, because they were preserved by thousands of unknown hands across 2,000 years. Whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you have done today, you are part of the long human story that the Romans helped to shape. There is one more thing we should discuss before sleep: the Roman army, because no story of Rome can be complete without it. The army was the engine of everything else. The Roman army did not begin as a professional force. In the early Republic, it was a citizen militia. Every Roman male between 17 and 60 was liable for military service. They were called up when needed. They served for a campaign. They went home to their farms when the campaign ended. They paid for their own armor and weapons. This system worked well when Roman wars were short and close to home. It did not work when Rome began to fight wars at the edges of the world. The system was reformed by a general named Gaius Marius, late in the 2nd century before the Common Era. Marius opened the army to anyone who would serve, not just the landowners. He provided weapons and armor at state expense. He paid the soldiers regular wages. He extended the term of service to many years. The result was a professional army, soldiers who served full-time, who knew their craft, who depended on the army for their living. These soldiers, for the first time in Roman history, owed their primary loyalty to their general, not to the state. The general paid them. The general won them booty. The general arranged their retirement settlements. When generals like Caesar later marched on Rome, their soldiers followed without hesitation. This was a structural change that would eventually undo the Republic. But before it undid the Republic, the professional Roman army became the most effective military force the ancient world had ever seen. A Roman legion consisted of about 5,000 men. They were organized into smaller units called cohorts, then centuries, then squads. Each level had its own commander. Orders could pass quickly down the chain. The legion could be deployed flexibly, broken into smaller units, recombined as the situation required. The basic soldier, the legionary, was armored heavily. He wore segmented plate armor over his torso, a helmet, sometimes greaves on his legs. He carried a large rectangular shield called a scutum, made of wood faced with leather. The shield was big enough to cover most of his body. He carried 2 throwing spears called pila, heavy javelins designed to bend on impact so they could not be thrown back. He carried a short sword called a gladius, about 2 feet long, double-edged, designed for stabbing in close quarters. The Roman tactic was to throw the pila as the enemy approached, then close with the gladius. The pila would either kill enemy soldiers outright or stick in their shields, weighing them down and forcing them to discard the shields. The Roman legionaries then fought shielded enemies who suddenly had no shields. The gladius did the rest. Roman soldiers were trained to stab, not slash. Stabbing was more efficient. A stab to the gut would kill or disable. A slash often only wounded. The legion fought in formation. The soldiers held their shields close together, creating a wall. The line moved together. When one soldier tired, he would step back, and the soldier behind him would step forward to take his place. The formation never stopped fighting. Individual soldiers could rest in shifts while the line continued to press the enemy. Roman soldiers were drilled relentlessly. Daily training was as exhausting as any battle. They marched 20 miles in armor in a day, then built a fortified camp at the end of every day's march. Every camp had the same layout. Every Roman soldier in any camp anywhere in the empire knew exactly where his tent was, where the latrines were, where the gate was. The camps were defensive structures that could resist surprise attack. They were also psychological. They imposed Roman order on whatever land the army crossed. Roman discipline was severe. The punishment for cowardice or desertion was death, often by stoning by the other soldiers. The punishment for losing a battle through carelessness could be decimation. Every 10th man in a unit chosen by lot and executed. This was rare, but the existence of it concentrated minds. Roman soldiers were terrified of their own officers more than of the enemy. But Roman soldiers were also rewarded. They received regular pay. They received shares of any booty taken in a campaign. They received decorations for individual valor. They received land grants when they retired, often in newly conquered provinces. A Roman soldier who served for 25 years and survived could expect to retire to a small farm somewhere in the empire with enough money to live out his life in modest comfort. The army built things, too. Between campaigns, soldiers built roads, bridges, walls, aqueducts. The famous Roman roads were largely built by the army. The famous Roman aqueducts were largely built by the army. Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain was built by Roman soldiers. So was the Antonine Wall further north. So were the limes, the long defensive lines along the Rhine and Danube rivers. Roman soldiers spent more time digging and building than they did fighting. The infrastructure of the empire was, in many ways, military infrastructure. This army conquered the world. From the time of Marius's reforms until the height of the empire, the Roman army defeated everyone it encountered. Gauls, Britons, Germans, Carthaginians, Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Parthians, Dacians, each in turn. The few times the Roman army was defeated, it was usually by treachery, by terrain, or by the brilliance of a single enemy commander like Hannibal. In open battle, on relatively flat ground, against a force of comparable size, the Romans almost always won. This was the engine of the empire. Whatever else Rome built, temples, laws, philosophy, literature, it was made possible by the steady rhythm of the legions, marching at 20 miles a day, building camps at every stop, training every morning, killing efficiently in every battle. Now we will tell a few more stories, briefly, because the night is long and there is room for more. The first is the story of Augustus, the first emperor. After Julius Caesar was killed, his adopted heir was a young man named Octavian. He was 18 years old at the time of the assassination. No one expected him to amount to anything. He was sickly. He was not a brilliant general. He was small, but he was patient. He was politically brilliant. He gradually outmaneuvered every competitor. Mark Antony, the great general. Marcus Lepidus, the rich politician. Cleopatra, the queen of Egypt. The Senate, which still claimed to govern. One by one, Octavian neutralized each of them. By the year 30 before the Common Era, after the defeat of Antony at the Battle of Actium, Octavian was alone. He had absolute power. He did something brilliant. He did not call himself a king. He did not call himself a dictator. He restored the forms of the Republic. The Senate met. The consuls were elected. The legal procedures were observed. He simply held all the most important offices himself, more or less permanently. He arranged the laws so that nothing could happen without his consent. But on the surface, the Republic continued. The Senate gave him a new title. They called him Augustus. The name meant venerable or sacred. It was a title nobody had held before. It made him almost divine without making him a king. Augustus ruled for 41 years. He was, in many ways, an extraordinary administrator. He reorganized the provinces. He set up the postal system. He standardized the laws. He maintained peace through the Roman world for most of his reign. The period of his rule and the rule of his immediate successors is called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It lasted, with some interruptions, for 2 centuries. Augustus was also a builder. He famously said that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. He rebuilt the Forum. He built dozens of new temples. He commissioned poets and historians to glorify the new age. Virgil wrote the Aeneid under Augustus's patronage. Horace wrote his odes. Livy wrote his history of Rome. The literature of the Augustan age was one of the high points of Western literature. When Augustus died, in the year 14 of the Common Era, he was deified. The Senate declared him a god. Temples were built to him. His birthday became a public holiday. The age of emperors had begun. There would be many more emperors after him, some good, some terrible. The Roman state would survive in the West for another 4 centuries, and in the East, as the Byzantine Empire, for another 1,500 years. But the Republic was definitively over. Augustus had buried it under the appearance of restoring it. Sleep gently. Power can be taken in many ways. Sometimes the most lasting forms of power are those that do not announce themselves loudly. Augustus did not call himself a king. He simply held all the levers. The second is the story of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor. A century and a half after Augustus, Rome reached the peak of its territorial and cultural power. The Mediterranean world was at peace, mostly. Trade flourished. Cities grew. Roads connected everything. This was the High Empire. The emperor at this time was Marcus Aurelius. He had come to the throne in the year 161 of the Common Era. He ruled for 19 years. He was, by all accounts, a thoughtful and just ruler, the philosopher on the throne that Plato had once imagined. Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic. The Stoic philosophy had been founded in Greece centuries earlier. It taught that human suffering came primarily from our reactions to events, not from the events themselves. It taught that we should focus only on what we could control, our own thoughts, our own actions, and accept everything else with equanimity. It taught that we should serve our duty without complaint and accept the universe as it was. Marcus Aurelius lived these teachings. He kept a journal, a private notebook in which he wrote his reflections, his moral self-examinations, his struggles with the temptations of power. After his death, this notebook was preserved. It has been read for almost 2,000 years. It is now called the Meditations. The book is unusual. It was never meant to be published. It was the emperor talking to himself. There is no false eloquence in it. There are no rhetorical flourishes. There is just a man in the midst of running an empire, trying to remember what matters. To be just, to be patient, to not be flattered by the powerful, to not be cruel to the weak, to accept that he, too, would die soon. Marcus Aurelius did die. He died in a military camp on the Danube frontier in the year 180 of the Common Era, while fighting against German tribes. He was 58 years old. He had been emperor for 19 years. His son Commodus succeeded him. Commodus was the opposite of his father, vain, cruel, fond of bloody spectacles in the arena. The High Empire began its long decline with Commodus, but the writings of Marcus Aurelius survived. They became one of the foundational texts of Stoic philosophy. They have been read by generals and writers and ordinary people for almost 2,000 years. The book continues to sell, even today. People still find comfort in the calm voice of an emperor who, despite holding more power than almost anyone in history, reminded himself daily that he was a mortal, that his power was temporary, and that what mattered most was doing his duty with integrity. Sleep gently. The greatest leaders in history have often been the ones who knew, in their hearts, that their greatness was an illusion. Marcus Aurelius knew. He held the most powerful position in the world. He spent his evenings telling himself that he was nothing special, that his job was to serve, not to enjoy his position, that he, like every other human, would soon be dust. This is the spirit of the best of Rome. Rest now with what you have. The Romans gave us many things. Their lasting gift is perhaps the example of human beings facing the great questions of life, duty, mortality, justice, power, and trying to answer them with seriousness. Not perfectly. They had their share of cruelty and folly, but they tried. They wrote it down. They left us their reflections. We inherit, in the deepest sense, not their buildings, but their thinking, their stories, their struggle to be human in a difficult world. Before we truly close, one more reflection on what the Romans built, on the physical legacy they left behind. Because the Romans were, above all, builders, they built roads. The roads were one of the wonders of the ancient world. The Romans constructed about 50,000 miles of paved roads across their empire. Many of these roads are still in use today, 2,000 years later, as the foundation of modern European highways. A Roman road was a serious engineering project. It was not just a path. It was a layered structure. The Romans would dig a trench about 3 feet deep. They would fill the bottom with large stones. On top of that, smaller stones mixed with mortar. On top of that, gravel. On top of all this, the surface, paving stones laid flat and tight, sloped slightly toward the edges so that rain would drain off. The result was a road that could carry heavy military traffic year-round, in any weather, for centuries. The famous Roman roads, the Appian Way, the Flaminian Way, the Aurelian Way, are still walkable today. Some of them still bear traffic. The roads were not just for trade and travel, though they served those purposes. They were, above all, for the army. Roman legions could move quickly along Roman roads. A legion could march 20 miles in a day on a good road. The roads connected every part of the empire to Rome. Trouble anywhere could be answered quickly. The roads made the empire possible. The Romans also built aqueducts. These were channels that brought fresh water from distant sources, springs in the mountains, often dozens or hundreds of miles away, to the cities. The aqueducts of Rome itself eventually supplied the city with hundreds of millions of gallons of fresh water per day. By the height of the empire, Rome had more water per capita than most cities of the medieval and early modern periods. The water flowed by gravity. The aqueducts had to maintain a slight, steady downhill slope across enormous distances. The Roman engineers calculated these slopes precisely. They built bridges where valleys had to be crossed. They drove tunnels through hills where the route demanded. The Pont du Gard in southern France, a Roman aqueduct bridge over the Gardon River, still stands, an architectural marvel 2,000 years old. The water, when it reached the city, was distributed through a network of pipes and channels. Public fountains and baths received the most. Private houses, if they could afford to pay for the privilege, could be connected to the water network as well. The wealthy had running water in their homes when the rest of the world was still drawing water from wells. The Romans built bathhouses. Every Roman city had public baths. The baths were not just for washing. They were social institutions. Romans would go to the baths daily, sometimes more than once, to bathe, exercise, socialize, conduct business. The baths had hot pools, cold pools, steam rooms, gymnasiums, libraries, gardens. They were the original health clubs and community centers combined. The largest of the Roman baths, the baths of Caracalla in Rome, could accommodate over 1,000 bathers at a time. The baths of Diocletian, built a few decades later, could hold 3,000. These were enormous structures. Their ruins still stand. The walls of the baths of Diocletian were so massive that a Renaissance church was built into them, using the existing walls as the walls of the church. The church is still in use today. The Romans built amphitheaters. The most famous is the Colosseum in Rome. It could hold 50,000 spectators. It had 80 entrances so that the entire stadium could be emptied in about 15 minutes. It had a system of underground tunnels and elevators for bringing gladiators and animals up to the arena floor. It had a retractable awning to shade the spectators from the sun. The engineering was sophisticated. The architecture was beautiful. The purpose was, of course, mass entertainment, often of a bloody kind. The Romans were not squeamish. The Romans built basilicas. A basilica was a large rectangular hall used for legal proceedings, markets, public gatherings. The form was so useful that, when Christianity became the religion of the empire, churches were built on the basilica plan. Most large Christian churches today, especially in the Catholic tradition, are descended from the Roman basilica. St. Peter's in Rome is, structurally, a Roman basilica adapted to Christian worship. The Romans built temples. The most famous surviving Roman temple is the Pantheon in Rome, a circular building with a great concrete dome lit by a single circular opening at the top of the dome. It was built in the 2nd century of the Common Era. The dome was the largest unsupported concrete dome in the world for over 1,000 years. It is still in use today as a Christian church. The interior is one of the most spectacular spaces in any building anywhere. The Romans built bridges. Many of them still stand. They built sewers. The Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of Rome, was begun in the 6th century before the Common Era and is still operating 2,500 years later as part of the modern Rome sewage system. They built walls around cities, walls along borders. Hadrian's Wall, in northern Britain, ran 73 miles across the country. Some of it still stands today. The legions built it. Roman soldiers spent years quarrying the stone, dressing it, laying it, mortaring it. The wall was meant to keep the unconquered Picts of Scotland out of Roman Britain. They built lighthouses. The most famous Roman lighthouse, the Tower of Hercules in northwest Spain, is still in use as a working lighthouse. It has guided ships into the harbor for nearly 2,000 years. They built underground heating systems. The hypocaust system, channels beneath the floor through which hot air from a furnace would flow, heated wealthy Roman homes and the great bathhouses. The technology was as advanced as anything in the world. After the fall of the Western Empire, this kind of heating disappeared from Europe for centuries. Europeans went back to open fires and froze in their drafty halls. The lost technology was not rediscovered until the modern era. They built concrete. Roman concrete was, by some measures, better than modern concrete. It incorporated volcanic ash, which gave it durability and a kind of self-healing property. Roman concrete structures have lasted for 2,000 years in conditions that would destroy modern concrete in 50. Modern researchers have studied Roman concrete to learn its secrets. Some of these secrets have been recovered. The technology is being revived in the 21st century. This is the physical legacy of Rome. We sometimes forget how much of our modern infrastructure is built on Roman foundations. When you drive across a stone bridge in Europe, it may have Roman roots. When you visit an old church, the basilica plan may be Roman. When you stand in an old town square, you may be standing in a former Roman forum. The bones of our cities, in much of Europe, are Roman. Beyond the physical buildings, the Romans built systems. The codified legal system, the standardized administration, the professional army, the taxation system, the provincial governance, the citizenship structure that gradually extended rights to more and more people across the empire. These are the institutional bones of Western civilization. They were built, refined, and exported by Rome. When you participate in a modern democratic election, you are using a tradition the Romans helped to shape. When you sign a contract that the state will enforce, the legal structure goes back to Roman law. When you take an oath of office, the form of the oath has Roman roots. When you study Latin grammar, you are studying the language that, in modified form, became the basis of half the world's languages. We are, in many real ways, still Roman. Not in our religion, not in our entertainment, not in our specific political arrangements, but in the deep structure of our civilization, in the ways we think about citizenship and law and infrastructure and engineering and public service. We are heirs of Rome. That is the inheritance. Sleep gently now. The night is long and the stories are done. Whatever roads you walk tomorrow, some of them were laid down, in spirit at least, by the Romans we have heard about tonight. Aeneas, looking for a new homeland. Numa, building the religion. Brutus, founding the republic. Horatius, holding the bridge. Cincinnatus, returning to his farm. Hannibal crossing the Alps. Caesar, falling on the Senate floor. Marcus Aurelius, writing his meditations in a cold tent on the Danube frontier. They are part of you now. They will be there tomorrow, in your decisions, in your patience, in your courage, in your willingness to do the hard things that need to be done. Sleep well. The empire is gone. The torches are out. But the dawn that comes after the long night is, in its own way, Roman too. Good night. These were 12 stories from the long history of Rome. The founding by Aeneas. The twin brothers raised by a wolf. The peaceful king Numa. The fall of the tyrant Tarquin. Horatius at the bridge. Mucius Scaevola with his burned hand. Cincinnatus the farmer. Hannibal at the gates. Spartacus and the slaves. Julius Caesar on the Senate floor. These are not all the stories. The Romans had thousands. They wrote them down for over 1,000 years. Their poets and historians filled libraries with the deeds of their ancestors. Cicero, Livy, Tacitus, Suetonius, Virgil, Ovid, Horace, these names and many more are still read today. Roman literature is one of the great inheritances of Western civilization. The Romans believed in stories. They believed that the deeds of the past shaped the character of the present. They told their children these tales not as entertainment, but as moral education. Be brave like Horatius. Be steady like Cincinnatus. Be willing to suffer for your country like Mucius. Be willing to do what is right, even when it costs you everything like Brutus the founder. Whether their actual ancestors had really done these things in the dramatic ways the legends described was less important to them than what the stories taught. The stories were how Rome built its character. They were the moral education of a civilization. We still live in their shadow. Our calendar is based on theirs. Our months are named after their gods. Our governments, particularly the American one, were modeled in part on the Roman Republic. Our buildings often imitate their architecture. Our laws still echo theirs. When you walk past a building with columns, you're walking past a memory of Rome. When you write the date, you are using their calendar. When you speak a language that derives from Latin, French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, you are speaking, in modified form, the language of Cicero and Caesar. When you read a contract, the structure of legal language comes, in many countries, directly from Roman law. The empire fell. The city was sacked by Goths in the 5th century of the Common Era. The lights of the great Mediterranean civilization went out. The Dark Ages followed. But the inheritance never disappeared. It survived in monasteries, in legal texts, in the fragments of poetry that were copied and preserved. When the Renaissance came, 1,000 years later, scholars rediscovered the Romans. They translated them. They imitated them. They built modern Europe partly on the foundations the Romans had left. We are, in many ways, still Roman. Our world rests on their world. Our way of thinking about citizenship, about duty, about law, about courage, much of it goes back to them. Tonight, you have heard a few of their stories. Most of what you have heard will not be remembered in detail tomorrow. That is fine. The patterns will sit in you. When you encounter situations in your own life that echo the Roman virtues, courage, duty, restraint, the willingness to sacrifice for something larger, you may feel a small recognition. That recognition is the work of these stories. Sleep gently now. The bridges have been held. The dictators have stepped down. The brothers have founded the city. The republic has fallen and the empire has risen. The story is done. You are part of the very long human tradition that the Romans helped to shape. 2,000 years from now, perhaps, people will still tell stories about today. They will tell them in languages we cannot imagine. But the human pattern, courage, duty, ambition, betrayal, sacrifice will be the same. We're not so different from the Romans. They were not so different from us. Good night, or good morning, or good afternoon. Sleep well. The torches will burn until dawn.